Hello and welcome to another session of Hermeneutics, calling this class Hermeneutics 101. And I wanted to have this class because I've found that a lot of people have kind of their own rules when it comes to interpreting the Bible, whether they learn them from other Bible studies that they've been in, or they've heard people preach and teach the Bible in a certain way, and they've kind of picked up certain rules, but they have probably found other people interpreting the Bible with different rules. And the reality is, we all should probably have the same rules when we're interpreting the Bible in the same way that we want, two different football teams to be playing by the same rules. Otherwise, we, feel like it's not really fun or enjoyable to watch. So we have to learn these rules, and very few people actually take the time to go and do that. But we're going through a textbook that is helping us to learn and understand what these rules are from the perspective of how people interpret ancient literature and interpreting history and interpreting these various biblical texts. This will be the last chapter. This week we're doing poetry, just kind of as a broad uh, swipe at poetry. Last month we did prose. And this will be the last month that we kind of do these big topic things, because starting next month, we'll look into chapter 9. We're going to look at the individual genres of the Old Testament, and then we'll look at the individual genres of the New Testament. And here is where we're going to, starting next month, I think, get into the big detail that's really important to us. We'll look at narrative sections and just kind of see how that works and how that functions and how to interpret that. And then we'll go to law, we'll look at prophecy, we'll look at gospels, we'll look at epistles, and that should pretty much give us enough content for the rest of the year. So this week is chapter 8. Next week we will start chapter 9, because chapter 9 has a variety of Old Testament genres in it, and hope it's something that you enjoy and find beneficial. So without further ado, we will get started and get situated here. Okay. All right. I'm going to put my my glasses on. All right. So this is session number 6. This does not correspond with the chapter that we're in my version of the textbook, which is the second edition. I do know there's 3 editions out right now, but in the second edition, this is dealing with chapter 8. But this is the 6th time that we have met. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you should be able to see an entire playlist where all of the previous sessions are available to you. So we'll be looking at poetry. And I had a conversation with someone last week who told me that the way that he goes about reading the Bible is that he reads everything literally until it comes to something that appears like you can't read it literally, and then you read it figuratively. And I understand that as kind of like a very simplistic way of reading the Bible. And he asked me what I thought about that. And I said, well, I think it's a little overly simplistic. I think because how do you know if something is meant to be interpreted figuratively or metaphorically? How do you know if it's supposed to be hyperbolic, or if there's poetic language, or if there's prophetic imagery? And what do you do if you think that it should be read literally, but the person next to you thinks that it should be read poetically? What do you do there? You're both now disagreeing on how to read the same text, because that way of reading is highly subjective. And so I think it's actually much better to realize that most of the Bible is written in prose, but a large section of it is written in poetry. And then to identify the type of genre of the particular book that you're reading, and to interpret that passage in light of that specific genre. So we'll go into more specifics with that starting in the next session, which will be next month. That'll be in the month of July. So last month we did prose. This month we are doing poetry. Okay, so what is biblical poetry? Well, biblical poetry refers to the sections of the Bible written in a poetic style. They are characterized by parallelism, by rhythm, vivid imagery, and expressive language. And there is a high degree of structure in biblical poetry. There's far more intended and deliberate structure with poetry than there is with the prose sections of the Bible. And as we start going through the examples, I think you're going to see and to appreciate it. So, poetry offers concrete images to convey an abstract idea. Okay. So, we can talk about the metaphor that we still use today, in which we describe earth shattering events. Earth shattering events. Okay. But earth shattering events do not involve the earth actually being shaken. It just means that, we feel like, there are new rulers, or there are wars that are going on. We feel like the kind of global landscape is changing so dramatically that we'll describe it with this sort of image. Okay. And sometimes using that sort of imagery makes the communication far more effective. When you're driving, you don't see signs that say go, yield, and stop. You just see green, yellow, and red. And that's just actually a far easier way of communicating something. Poets want the readers to experience the topic through the use of vivid language. Okay, so the poets are going to be the biblical authors that are employing poetry. Okay, and that's what they want. They want the readers to appreciate the poetry that's being used through the sort of language, the structured and the vivid language that is being used in that passage. We're going to see that poetry has tightly arranged lines. It's going to use metaphors and images. And the tightly arranged lines will become very important to see when we start to look at parallelism. And as I was looking at how much information there was on parallelism, there's actually enough information on parallelism to do an entire segment in and of itself. We could spend an entire hour and a half just on parallelism. So there's a lot of that in there. But I think once you start to see the the general ways in which parallelism appears, then you'll know the forms. You'll be able to recognize them when you read them, but they are all over the place. Now, if prose takes up 2/3 of the biblical account, then poetry is 1/3, 1/3 of the Bible. I don't think most people realize how much of the Bible is actually poetry. It's 1 out of 3 words. Um, and I think once you realize how much it's there, you are far more likely to anticipate it, especially in certain types of biblical genre. You'll be much more likely to anticipate it. And that way, you're not just reading everything literally and then just, thinking, well, maybe I'll come across poetry if I see it absolutely clearly there. If you know that it's pretty common, 1 out of 3 words, then you're much more likely to anticipate it and to not be surprised when it takes place. Now, in the prophetic books, so think Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the book of the 12, especially the book of Revelation, the contents of those books are mostly poetry. 2/3 of the prophetic books are poetry. And that's a lot. I mean, that's most of poetry. Most of Isaiah is poetry. Most of Jeremiah is poetry. So that's a big deal. So for the people that tend to be biblical literalists, people that read the Bible literally, when it comes to the prophetic books, if your approach is to read prophetic books literally, then you're missing out on the poetry that's there. And as you're seeing, poetry is most of the prophetic books. Okay. Doesn't mean that they don't have literal things to say, but it means that they're going to convey them with vivid language, with the imagery, and with a variety of other poetic devices. Okay. So again, that's a particular type of biblical genre that you'll see both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, in which you should almost default to reading it poetically and be surprised whenever you see something that's not poetic, as opposed to saying, I'm going to start and read everything literally. And then maybe if I come across something that's poetic or figurative, then I'll interpret it that way. So again, just knowing how frequent the poetic language appears will help us to take these passages seriously. So, although poetry is commonplace in Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Songs, that should be Song of Songs, and Lamentations, it is also frequent in narratives and in prophetic works. There are a lot of people that think that narratives must be completely literal because they're mostly prose, but there is poetry that appears in the narratives. And there are also hymns, songs in the New Testament. Here's kind of a pop quiz for you here. Which book in the New Testament contains the most hymns? And it's not exactly what you would think, but actually it's the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, we have, depending on how you count them, because there's a little bit of debate on how you count them, there could be anywhere between like 7 and 9 songs or hymns in that book. Okay. And you tend to think of Revelation, well, that's just a book of prophecy and imagery, but it is just laced with hymns that, of course, are written in poetry. Okay. The textbook that we're using argues that, quote, readers must be careful not to de-poeticize its form by ignoring its literary conventions. Okay. And I think they made up that word de-poeticize because it was underlined in red for me. But I think you get the point. You can't be a reader to where you're defaulting and saying everything must be read literally. And so if you come across any poetry, you're thinking, no, I want to read this literally. And then you remove all the poetry, you remove all the imagery, you remove all of the vivid language from that. And in doing so, you're ignoring the deliberate attempt by the biblical author, who is also a poet, to employ a particular poetic literary convention. Okay. So we must be very, very careful not to de-poeticize the poetic language that we see in the Bible. Okay. And it's mostly going to appear in the Old Testament, and that's not surprising because the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is 77% of the Protestant canon. Okay. So the sound of poetic work. So the chapter began by giving some examples, and it gave some kind of transliterated Hebrew out there for you. But I quickly realized that average English readers of the Bible that haven't taken biblical languages are not really able to appreciate this. And as you're probably aware, by taking the biblical languages and by putting them into English, it is almost impossible to convey that poetry in an original language and to put it into English or whatever translation of the Bible that you're using. Whether you have a Spanish Bible or an Italian Bible or whatever it may be. But I thought by reading it out loud that even if you can't understand Hebrew or Greek, that you might be able to appreciate some of these things. So fortunately, readers of the original languages will find it easier to observe poetry than those relying on English translations. And so these examples will help English readers appreciate the poetry existing in the original languages. Okay. So I think I have 2 slides out of the 14 that I have here. We'll talk about some of the original languages, and you can kind of at least hear out loud some of them, and maybe you can make a couple of notes in your own Bible to kind of see how it works. Okay, so here's an interesting example. Jeremiah 49 verse 1 says, "Why then has Malcolm taken possession of Gad, and his people settled in its cities?" Okay, so you can almost read that like, okay, I see 2 lines. Why has this person taken possession of Gad, and of course, and his people settled in its cities? That is the people of Malcolm settled in the cities of Gad. Okay, so you get a little bit of parallelism that's taking place there. We'll talk a little bit more about parallelism, but I want you to listen and I want you to hear the repeating sound of the A vowels. Okay, so I want you to just kind of hear the repeating of the ah sounds, which would have been deliberately arranged in poetry, but it's difficult to see here in English. Okay, so we have Madua, Yarash, Malcolm, 8, God, Va, sorry, Va'amo, Ba'arav, Yashav. See here, there's a lot of the ah sounds that are there, and that seems to be deliberately intended by the author in poetically arranging this particular passage. Okay, and so we have similar types of poetry in English, but this is part of the poetry that's there. And you can see if you're just reading in English, you're not going to read it that way, or you're not going to appreciate it. Okay. Here's another one. Psalm 127, verse 1, where it says, Unless Yahweh guards the city, the watchmen keep awake in vain. Okay. All right. I think this is just the common SH sound, the sh sound that appears. Okay. So we have Im Yahweh, Lo, Yashamar, Ear, uh, Shava, yeah. Um, Shakad, Shomer. Yeah, so there's a lot of SH sounds that are taking place there that uh, indicate a deliberate poetic arrangement. Okay, that's how they do it. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this one in Job 14, verse 2, and Job is just full of poetry. It's all over the place. Basically, anything outside of the first couple of chapters, you could pretty much assume is going to be poetry. It's actually some of the most intense poetry in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so like a flower, he comes forth and withers. He also flees like a shadow and does not remain. Okay, so here I think I'm trying to remember what is he. I'll read it out loud, see if I can catch it. Okay. So we got uh, Katsik, Yatsa, Vayamal, Vayib, Rach, Katsil, Lo, Ya'amod. Okay. I think it's kind of like the O sounds that are repeating there. But there's a variety of like similar sounding sounds that again you just can't see that in English. It also appears in the New Testament. The opening line of Hebrews chapter 1 has a variety of at least words that begin with a P sound. Okay. Or the first couple of words have a repeating whole sound. Okay. So this is kind of a long sentence that actually continues on into verse 2. But it says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways. And the passage goes on in verse 2 by saying, has in these last days spoken to us through a son. Okay. But it's deliberately arranged with these P sounds. So you got polymeros, K, polytropos, paleotheos, lalisas, tis patrasin in tis prophetes. There's a lot of P sounds. And at the beginning, there's a lot of poly sounds. And that's been identified by people as New Testament Greek poetry. Okay. So again, not going to do a lot of that there, but it's indicative of the fact that poetry does appear in the original languages, and it's just nearly impossible to bring it out into English. But hopefully, for those of you that don't have access to biblical languages, you're able to somewhat appreciate that. Okay. So in these, I think I was able to put the Hebrew down and put some of them into a different color, and I think you'll be able to recognize that the poetry is actually taking place. Okay. So in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7, talks about what God did. He looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress. Okay. And so you can look at this, and for those of you that didn't already know, you need to be reading your Hebrew from right to left. And so what you'll see here is that you'll see, and one of those I forgot to highlight the mem. That's okay. All right. So you can see that kind of the first two pairings of yellow words have similar looking letters, and in the second two, and again we're going from right to left, they have the same ones as well. So, but the poetry is not able to be brought out into English, but it's there in Hebrew. So when I read it out loud, you'll probably be able to hear it. And so I'll kind of indicate the words that I think are going to be sounding alike. Okay. So you got Vayik, Vayikav la Mishpat. Okay, that's one word. So hear that Mishpat word. Vahiga Mishpach. Okay, so those two words sound very similar. Okay. Litsadeka. Okay, that's one word. So that kind of the tzedakah word. Vahiga Sa'aka. So again, words that sound very, very similar are intentionally arranged poetically by Isaiah, who is not just a prophet, he's also a poet. Okay. Psalm 6, verse 10, all my enemies will be ashamed and greatly dismayed. They shall turn back. They will suddenly be ashamed. Okay. So you can kind of see this a little bit in English. You could see the ashamed verb is appearing here twice, and you have the word dismayed, which is related to the word ashamed. Okay. And so here you're going to hear the sound of either yabash or yashab. So you have a yod, a bait, and then a shin in a couple of different arrangements. Okay, so you got yebo shu, vayibahalu, ma'od, call. Let's see, oh, by. Sorry, my glasses here. Okay. Um, Yashuvu, Yeboshu, Raga. There you go. So three words there sounding very, very similar. And it's a little bit brought into English, but that again is the poet doing what poets do best. The one here in Matthew 16, verse 18 is pretty important, but again, it's difficult to do unless you just want to say that Peter's name is Rocky. Okay, so this is where Jesus says after Peter courageously announces that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He says, I will also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Okay. So the way that this works is that Peter's name is Petros, but the word for rock is Petra. Okay. So Jesus is kind of playing off, doing a play on words between Peter's name and upon this rock, as in upon Peter. Okay. So you can hear a little bit in Greek. Okay. Kadove si lego otce Petros. There's that first word. Kap tofti t Petra. There's the second word. Ikodomiso muti ekklesion ke pile avu u katis gisusin oftis. Okay. As you can probably tell, I'm much more fluent in my Greek. I don't do my Hebrew as often as I should. Okay, all right. Now that's the last of the biblical languages that we're going to do. But what I wanted to convey is that poetry appears far more frequently than we realize because we are reading the Bible in an English translation, and it's just nearly impossible to bring that poetry out. But that's the sort of thing that they use. They use words that sound very similar in order to make a particular point. Okay, so let's talk about parallelism. We got a lot of examples of parallelism in the Bible. And again, we should not be surprised to see it in the prophets, because remember, the prophets are two-thirds poetry, mostly poetry. And they typically will appear in these two-part lines. So look at this parallelism, okay? Hear the word of Yahweh, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Okay, so this is not exactly a synonymous parallelism, because you can see in the second part of both lines, we have the rulers of Sodom and the people of Gomorrah. Those are two separate cities, but they're closely uh, uh, located, at least geographically. But clearly, the summons to hear the word of Yahweh is very similar, almost the same as giving ear to the instruction of our God. Okay, so who is Yahweh? Yahweh is our God. Hearing the word of Yahweh means to give ear to his instruction. That's important. Okay, so you can see that there's parallelism between the two lines, but it's not exactly synonymous parallelism. It's close. It's close. Okay, Psalm 77, verse 1. My voice rises to God, and I will cry aloud. My voice rises to God, and he will hear me. Okay. Obviously the point there is that if we're going to cry aloud, then God is going to hear that particular cry. That's important, okay? But you have the parallelism in the first parts of both lines because the voice rises to God, okay? So again, it's not exactly a synonymous parallelism, but it's very, very close, okay? In fact, the second half of the second line is kind of giving the answer to what was done in the first line. But you can see it's very easy to see it when you separate it kind of one line on top of the other. That's why I actually prefer the NASB because it does this. The NASB will put one line above the other as opposed to just making a long running paragraph where it's a lot more difficult to see and recognize these things. A lot of parallelism in Proverbs, a lot of contrasting parallelism, as you can see here. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. Okay, so you can have the contrast there between righteousness and sin. Righteousness is going to do something positive to a nation. A nation is just, a group of people. But sin, the opposite of righteousness, is not going to exalt. It's going to be a disgrace to any people. Basically, that's a synonym for a nation. Okay, so that would be a contrasting parallelism. Okay, they're not saying the same thing, but one of them finds its meaning by being the opposite of the other one. Okay, and so you can see obviously one of them is what you're supposed to do, and the other one is what you're supposed to avoid. Okay, all right. Amos chapter 8, verse 10 says, "Then I will turn your festivals into mourning." Okay, and all your songs into lamentation. Okay, this is very closely synonymous parallelism. This is God talking. I'm going to turn your festivals, these are the Jewish festivals of the Hebrew Bible, I'm going to turn them into mourning, which is parallel with the lamentation. And of course, the songs that they're singing in the festivals, they're not going to be singing in joy. They're not going to be rejoicing. They're going to be lamenting in their mourning. Okay. So again, you could see that. You could see how the parallelism works there. The word and kind of helps us to see that, to where in the previous example, the word but helped us to recognize the contrast. All right, how about this one? This one I think is a good example of synonymous parallelism. Proverbs 19, verse 5. A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will not escape. Okay, so not going unpunished means that you're not going to escape, meaning you're not going to escape the judgment. And of course, a false witness is someone who tells lies. Although a false witness is something that's a little bit more specific than just telling lies. Telling lies is kind of generically saying something that's not truthful. But a false witness is someone that is either in a courtroom setting or saying something about the character of another person that would either get that person in trouble or vindicate that person as far as their behavior is concerned. Okay? So you could see the parallelism there. And again, it's easy to see it when you have the two lines set up that way. Let's look at some more examples, okay? Here's Jesus talking, okay, at the end of Matthew chapter 11, where he says, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light," okay? That is synonymous parallelism, okay? Yoke and burden are synonyms. Easy and light are also synonyms, okay? So that's important, okay? He's not talking about the yolk of an egg. He's not talking about the yoke of his ox. He's talking about the yoke of his teaching, of his discipleship. Okay. Proverbs 11, verse 20. The perverse in heart are an abomination to Yahweh, but I see the but there, so I'm thinking, okay, we got a contrasting parallelism. The blameless in their walk are his delight. Okay. So we could either be an abomination to Yahweh, as in Yahweh's going to find our works detestable, or Yahweh can be delighted in the walk of the blameless. Okay, and that's important, especially for those people that are Calvinists that think that God doesn't actually change. He doesn't actually do anything. He's kind of stoic. But here, actually, we can change the disposition of God. God can actually find delight in the walk of people that are blameless. Okay, so you can see the contrasting parallelism that is there. Don't do one, do the other. It's pretty easy to see which one is the one you're supposed to do. Here's another example, Psalm 103, verse 13. Just as a father has compassion on his children, so Yahweh has compassion on those who fear him. Okay, this is a very infrequently cited passage to describe Yahweh as the Father alone. That's how the parallelism works, okay? Notice that Yahweh here is only one person. Yahweh has compassion on those who fear him. Notice that singular pronoun. And that singular pronoun is defined in the earlier part of the parallelism as the Father. Okay, well, who are the children of Yahweh? Those are the people that fear him. Okay, so the relationship with Yahweh is not strictly speaking genetic, of course. Indicates that it's a familial relationship based on behavior. Okay, so those who fear him are his children, and Yahweh, of course, is the Father alone. Okay, all right, so that's it's some good Unitarian teaching in there. But you see, it's all over the place. You got to see that, and so and the writer just kind of casually says this because he assumes everyone's going to pick this up and see it. Okay, so we could also have a little bit more complex parallelism where we have a line that's going to be parallel with another line, but in between those two lines, we have some sort of further expansion. Okay, so God says in Isaiah 45:12, it is I who made the earth and created man on it. I stretched out the heavens with my hands, that parallels with I who made the earth, and I ordained all their host. So we can see kind of a general line, something that God did, and then something that further unpacks and gives a little bit more clarity. So he made the earth and the man upon it, as in upon the earth. He stretched out the heavens and he ordained all their host. That is the host of heaven, meaning the heavenly angels. Okay. But clearly God is the one that's doing it. He made the earth, he made the heavens with my hands. Okay. Notice again that singular language there, my, that singular pronoun. And of course, the singular subject of the verb, I made, I stretched, I ordained their host. And it's clear that the I is also there implied in the creation of man. It's there in the Hebrew, but it's clearly implied here in the English. Okay, so we can see how that works. So I kind of indented that to make it a little bit easier to see how the parallelism, it's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's pretty easy to see when you set the passage out like that. Let's look at some more examples. Okay, Proverbs 4, verse 1. Hear, O sons, the instruction of a father, and give attention that you may gain understanding. Okay, so we have the summons to hear and the summons to give attention. Okay, now in the second line, when it says give attention, it's assumed that you're going to supply that you are giving attention to the instruction of a father. Okay, you are the sons. You know, we have a father figure that's teaching you. Okay, and the hearing, of course, is the appropriate disposition of the children to the father that is teaching them. And the second line, of course, gives us a little bit extra information. You're going to gain understanding by listening and giving attention there. So we have partial parallelism, but some of the second line doesn't have to repeat the elements of the first line. Okay, obviously you are giving attention to the Father. It doesn't have to say that again. Okay, all right. Here you can have parallelism to where it gets intensified in a way that's very poetic. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. Okay, so your barns are full, and your vats are going to have lots of wine, new wine, and so you get kind of an intensification in the parallelism there. Okay, so there's an abundance of blessing in both lines. The second line, I mean, it's there's intensification that's there. Okay, again, it's pretty easy to see if you can set them in one line above the other. Okay. Sometimes the poetic part extends into multiple verses. So here is the first time that personified wisdom speaks in the book of Proverbs. Okay. It says in verse 20, wisdom shouts in the street. And then you'll notice the parallel line. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates of the city, she utters her sayings. Okay. So you can see the parallel lines in the street, in the square, at the head of the noisy gates, at the entrance of the gates. Okay. So what do these all have in common? They are all in urban places and they're all out there in the public. Okay. They're not way out there in a field and they're not in private places. They're not indoors. Okay. And so this is wisdom. She's not whispering like this. She's not being really quiet. She is shouting. She is lifting her voice. She is crying out. She is uttering her sayings. Okay. So again, you can see the parallelism there that is taking place. And of course, if you're the reader, you're thinking, okay, wisdom is trying to tell us something. I better pay attention. I think that's the most obvious way to read that. Okay. And then we can have Yahweh creating with his agent, his instrumental agent. Okay. And so Proverbs 3:19, it says, Yahweh by wisdom founded the earth. Okay. But then we have the parallels with wisdom. We have understanding and we have God's knowledge. Okay. So Yahweh founded the earth with wisdom. He established the heavens with a parallel for wisdom, which is God's understanding. And then the deeps were broken up with his knowledge. Notice that pronoun there, his, that singular pronoun indicates that Yahweh is only one person. Okay. But it also shows us that the wisdom that we saw there in chapter 1 is just a personification. It's not an actual female person because wisdom appears here and it's just set in parallel with God's understanding and God's knowledge. Okay. You don't think that understanding and knowledge are conscious persons there up there in heaven. Okay. So, but you can see there, God creates with his wisdom, God creates with his understanding, God creates with his knowledge. What does that mean? Well, if God creates with his wisdom and his knowledge and his understanding, it means that his creation is wise, it's ordered, it has purpose, it's not broken, it's not haphazard, it's not chaotic. God has arranged it and ordered it in a wise and knowledgeable way. That's what it means for the poet to say that God founded the earth with his wisdom. Okay. But again, recognizing the parallelism is going to help us to identify this figure of wisdom. Clearly, it's a personification. Okay. All right. Psalm 88. I wanted to put the entire psalm in here, but I thought let's just put the most poetic parts of this. But Psalm 88, like most of it, is just parallelism. Most of this. So I thought let's just look at that. Okay. So I'm not putting these in lines one on top of the other, but you'll see I'm using the NASB. You'll see that it will capitalize the first letter of the next line. So here it says, "Let my prayer come before you, incline your ear to my cry." Okay. So even though incline is in the middle of a sentence, they're going to capitalize it because it's meant to be the second line of this poetic arrangement. Okay. So we want our prayer to come before God. And of course, by asking our prayer to come to him, we want him to listen to us. And so the parallel line says, incline your ear to my cry. Okay. Obviously, the cry is further defining your prayer. Okay. My soul has had enough troubles and my life has drawn near to Sheol. Okay. So notice there that our soul is further defined as our life. Okay. The soul is not a separate thing that's inside you as if you have like a body and a soul, two parts. Your soul just is your life. Your soul just is you. If your soul dies, you die. Okay. So again, it's very easy to see in the synonymous parallelism of the Hebrew Bible. And that particular parallel point of soul being defined as life in the parallelism, that happens like hundreds of times. That is all over the place. Okay. Now, drawing near to Sheol, look how it's further defined. I am reckoned among those who go down to the pit. Okay. So going to Sheol, to the grave, is going down to a pit. I have become like a man without strength. Okay. Obviously, someone who dies, who goes down to the grave, who goes down to the pit, has no strength. That much is clear. Okay. Forsaken among the dead. So notice there that people are described as dead, like the slain who lie in the grave. Okay. So the dead, of course, in the grave. Okay. And they're lying there. Okay. Notice that's where the people are. The people are in the grave, not their bodies. The slain, the people, the dead people are there in the grave. Okay. Again, I'm preaching in the choir for most of you, but this is very, very clear to see once we understand and we recognize and appreciate the parallelism that's there. Okay. Whom you remember no more. Okay. And they are cut off from your hand. Okay. So God's not talking to them. God's not considering them. They're dead and they have no activity. Okay. And then here, notice the poetic imagery that he's using. This is the psalmist. You have put me in the lowest pit. That's hyperbole. Okay. In dark places, in the depths. Okay. Well, obviously he's not dead, but he's saying that the circumstances of his particular disaster and catastrophe are as if he is dead and as if he's among all of those that have been slain. The passage goes on. Will your loving kindness be declared in the grave? The answer is no. Your faithfulness in Abaddon, okay? It's just a Hebrew word for destruction, okay? Because when people are destroyed, they're put in the grave, okay? So notice the other parallelism, the loving kindness of God is further described as his faithfulness, God's faithfulness towards his people, okay? So I think that's important because I don't know about you, but I don't use the word loving kindness every day unless I'm reading out loud the NASB. That's that Hebrew word hesed. Means covenant faithfulness, basically, but you could see it's further defined for you as faithfulness. Okay, that helps you. Okay, this is God's faithfulness, his loving faithfulness, covenant love towards his people. Okay, will your wonders be made known in the darkness and your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? Okay, so the grave, the Abaddon, the word for destruction, the darkness and the land of forgetfulness. Those are kind of all, at least very closely synonymous categories. But the wonders, the wonderful works of God are further defined as God's righteousness, God's righteous acts. Okay. Righteousness is not a moral part of God. It's his deeds that he does in faithfulness to his covenant. Okay. So there, the wonderful works or the wonderful acts is further defined as God's righteousness. Okay. All right. But I, O Yahweh, have cried out to you for help. And in the morning, my prayer comes before you. Okay. So the crying out is described as a prayer. O Yahweh, why do you reject my soul? And why do you hide your face from me? So notice rejection, hiding your face, and then soul is further described as the psalmist's own self, me. Again, soul is just you. It's not a piece of a thing that you have inside you. You are a soul. And so we saw that twice here in one particular psalm. So again, like if we just slow down and we just read this very carefully, we can learn a lot of the meaning of these words because we could see, okay, I might not understand what the first line means, but I can understand the second line. I can recognize that parallelism is taking place. And then I could use the second line and a word that I can recognize to further define another word. So like God's faithfulness is described as his loving kindness. Okay. God's righteousness is further described as his wonders, his wonderful works. Okay. So again, I'm hoping that you can see this and come to appreciate it a little bit more. Okay. So that's enough on parallelism, but really there's a lot more. And if you want to read the chapter for this month, chapter 8, there are several other examples of parallelisms that it records. Okay. Chiasms. Okay. This is something that if all you had was a Bible, you would probably never see this. You would probably never know that the biblical authors do this. Okay. So what is a chiasm? A chiasm is an intentionally structured passage. It could be a single verse. It's usually a variety of verses, but a chiasm can extend even to multiple chapters. And what they do is it comes from the Greek letter chi, modern key, which is an X, to where you have kind of like 2 points that begin and they eventually meet in the center. Okay. And I'll kind of give you an example of what this looks like. So this is the prologue of the Gospel of John. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And I think that the prologue is intentionally arranged as a chiasm. This is not my chiasm. I actually got this from another scholar, and I found it to be really, really convincing. Anytime someone shows you a chiasm, you should be skeptical, but not immediately dismissive of it. Okay, read through it and see if it makes sense. Okay, because the chiasm has a couple of interesting traits. Okay, and so as it has these kind of lines that slowly move themselves towards the center, the lines are meant to have complementary topics. Okay, so you see the A at the top, the Logos was with God. That's in the first two verses. And then in the final line, A prime, the unique Son is with God. Okay, so you have the Logos with God, the unique Son is with God. Okay, I can see how that works. Okay, the B line, we have creation through the Logos, and then B prime, grace and truth through Jesus. Okay, the C line, receive light and life, or life and light, excuse me. And then the C prime line, receive grace. D talks about John the Baptist. D prime, John the Baptist again. Again, that's kind of a big deal. E, negative response to logos, and then E prime, positive response to logos. And then the key thing of the chiasm, the most important part of it, is the center point, because the center point is meant to be the most important part of the chiasm that the author is trying to convey to the reader. And that's really important. So you have to understand. And chiasms were very common outside of the Bible. They were very common in the ancient Near East and in the literature that we have there. So we have several examples of chiasms. We know how they work. We know how they function. And so if the center line is verses 12 through 13, then that means that is the most important part of the chiasm, which means it's the most important part of the prologue. Okay. Despite the fact that a lot of people tend to think that verse 14 is the most important part of the prologue. It's not. It's verses 12 through 13, which says those who receive the Logos become the children of God. Okay. And we have confirmation of that because we know that the passage goes on. It says, many who received him, many who received him and believed in his name, they became children of God. And the purpose statement of the Gospel of John in John 20, verses 30 to 31, says that these things are written that you would believe that Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you will have life in his name. So you have life in his name in the center part of the chiasm here. Those who receive the Logos believe in his name and they receive life. Okay. So again, if someone shows you a chiasm, read it very carefully, read it with discernment, but don't assume that, oh, this is just kind of a weird, strange arrangement. I should immediately dismiss it. Chiasms are intentionally put there by the biblical authors, but for whatever reason, we don't arrange the English translations like this to where you can see it. Okay. So if you want to, you could just go into Google and say, give me some examples of biblical chiasms, and you'll find hundreds of them. They're all over the place. Okay. So key thing you want to know is that you're going to have lines that have similar topics. They're intentionally arranged, but the middle line is the most important part of the passage. Not the first part, not the last part. It's the middle part, the center part of the chiasm where it meets. Okay, so that's chiasms there. Okay, merismus. Okay, a word that we don't typically use every day. I don't use it every day. What does it mean? It means the author is going to use some sort of poetry, and he or she is going to use extremes, one extreme and another extreme, but the purpose is to say, let's talk about the totality of everything that's in between those extremes. Okay. And these are pretty common in the Bible. I think that once you are aware that this is a particular type of poetry, you'll appreciate it more and you'll recognize it when you see it. Okay, so Psalm 139, verse 2, the psalmist says, you, God, you know me when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. Okay, so when I'm sitting down and when I get up. Okay, so I mean, you're either doing two of those things. Either you're sitting or you're standing. Okay, so those are the two extremes. So of course, everything in between indicates that God also knows us during those things too. And of course, God is able to know us by perceiving us. Okay, here's another one, pretty easy. God created the heavens and the earth. What that means is that God created the heavens and the earth, and of course, everything in between those things. Okay, everything in the heavens and in the earth, and everything that's in between that. We get that. And of course, Genesis 1 goes on to unpack that summary statement. Okay. Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10. This is quite a few of them. Okay. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Okay. This, by the way, this should be one of your go-to verses if you're teaching someone about the Holy Spirit, because in the parallelism there, we can see that God's Spirit is just God's presence. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? The Spirit of God is the presence of God that you can't escape. Okay. But notice it's God's presence. It's Yahweh's presence. You see that pronoun there, your spirit, your presence. Okay. It's something that belongs to God. It's part of his own makeup. Okay. And then notice the extremes that are used here. If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. Okay. So the point is, if I was to go up to the heavens, I would find God. If I was to go all the way down to the bottom, I would find God. And so everything in between, I would find God there as well. Okay. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. Okay. So we have, again, those extremes, the far side of the sea, that's kind of considered to be like the farthest you can possibly go, especially if you're a Jewish person. I don't know if you know this, but Jewish people, they don't like the water. They don't like the water. The water is typically in poetic literature, it's kind of the poetic chaos that always needs to be calmed. Think of the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, dividing the sea, walking on the water, stilling the water. You'll see how that works. Okay, you can see there again, kind of the extremes are there, but it's not meant to just give you two. It's meant to say, here are the two extremes and everything in between. Okay, here's another one. I am the first and the last. Of course, that means everything in between. Besides me, there is no God. Okay, that's a title that God has. He gives for himself. Yahweh has that for himself. First and the last, and of course, everything in between. There's a totality of God's influence. This one I think is interesting. This comes right after the Shema of Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. Okay, where it talks about the oneness of God and the command to love that one God with all of your heart, soul, and strength. And you're to impress these on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk on the road, when you lie down and then when you get up. Okay. Well, it doesn't mean that you only do it at those 4 times, when you're sitting and walking, when you're lying down, when you get up. Now, we've already seen lying down and getting up in Psalm 139, verse 2, when I sit and when I rise. Okay. These are meant to be kind of the extremes, which means do it all the time. And that's important. Okay. And again, you get a lot more out of these passages when you recognize that. You get the intention of the author. All right. All right. Inclusios, images, and similes. Okay. I'm not going to give a lot of examples for these. I'm just going to give a couple of them because I think they're pretty easy to see. And if you want to know about images, go look at my playlist on the Book of Revelation. There's hundreds of them there. Okay, so an inclusio basically is something that's said that kind of bookends a particular passage or a particular chapter. Okay, so here in Psalm 8, which only has 9 verses, it begins by saying, "O Yahweh, our Lord, how majestic is your name and on the earth." That's in verse 1 and in verse 9. Verse 9 is the last verse of the psalm. So it begins with this saying, it ends with this saying. So that means that is the topic of the psalm, and everything in between it is meant to be read in light of that inclusio statement. That's the function of an inclusio. It kind of bookends both sides, and it means that everything in between needs to be read in light of that overarching theme. Okay? That's important. Okay, let's look at images. Okay, so here's some imagery from the book of Revelation. Surprise, surprise, Revelation is full of imagery. Okay, so here are 2 different but complementary images for Jesus. Okay, so John is told by an angel, "Stop weeping. Behold, the lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome. He has conquered so as to open the book and its 7 seals." And then I saw in between the throne with the 4 living creatures and the elders, I didn't see a lion. I saw a lamb standing as if slain. So clearly he's seeing Jesus, but it's using the imagery of a lion. and also the imagery of a lamb. Okay. So the first thing is that he hears there's a lion. When you think of a lion, you think, okay, that's a powerful warrior animal. Okay. He's from the tribe of Judah, and Judah is told at the deathbed of his father, Jacob, in Genesis 49, that Judah is going to resemble a lion. Okay. So it's a way of describing Judah's tribe. But of course, the promise is that out of the tribe of Judah, who's a lion, is going to be a king, a royal figure that has a scepter. And then we have the root of David, probably is more accurately translated as the shoot of David, the offspring of David. David is known to be the warrior king, very clearly. I mean, Solomon's not known as the warrior king. And so you have two kind of, actually three warrior images there. You have a lion, tribe of Judah, and the descendant of David. So you're thinking, okay, I'm going to see a powerful image, a powerful warrior image, a powerful warrior Messiah, the one who has conquered so that he can open up this scroll and the seven seals. But when he looks, he doesn't see a powerful image. In fact, he sees the least powerful image you can see. He sees a lamb, which is not a powerful, ferocious, animal. It's one that powerful, ferocious animals eat. And the lamb is doing two things. It's standing and it's dead. How does that work? Well, it's bringing the imagery of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and I want you to think of both of them at the same time. It's standing up as if it's dead, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. That's because we have to take in all the imagery that's there. So there we learn that the way in which Jesus conquers is not exactly through powerful war and violence and bloodshed. The conquering of Jesus takes place by dying as a sacrificial lamb. Jesus conquered in all the wrong ways, okay? So clearly, there's a lot of imagery that's there, and that's just two verses. But my goodness, we could sit there and talk about that and the meaning of that for an hour. Because when you think of the lamb, you're thinking, okay, I've got the sacrificial lamb, so you've got Passover imagery that's there, okay? Each of those images, I think, are very loaded. All right, similes. Okay, not to be confused with smiles. Similes. Similes occur when you have something that is like something, or it is as something, or it's compared to something. So Jesus in the Gospels say, what is the kingdom of God like? The kingdom of God is like a nobleman, or the kingdom of God is like a king settling his accounts, or it's like a sower, or the kingdom of God is like a man seeking fine pearls. Like. Similes. Okay. Now, in this one, in Ezekiel chapter 1, Ezekiel has a vision of God, but he doesn't want to say that he saw God. So he's going to qualify everything with this word like. And it's the same preposition, la, in Hebrew. And so when you see in Hebrew, it's just like this preposition over and over and over. I don't remember how many times, but I think it's something like 40 times. And so I want you to kind of see here how Ezekiel, it's like he wants to try to convey in written language the imagery that he saw. He doesn't want to give you the impression that he actually saw God, because you can't see God and live, and God doesn't reveal himself to people that way. So it's like look at how the sort of care that he's using here. Okay. Now, above the expanse that was over their heads, he's talking about like these creatures, these heavenly creatures, there was something resembling a throne. Okay. Like lapis lazuli in appearance, and on that which resembled a throne, high up, was a figure with the appearance of a man. Then I notice from the appearance of his loins and upward something like glowing metal that looked like fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his loins, I should stress the word appearance there, and downward I saw something like fire, and there was radiance around him. Like it resembles this. It was like this. It was as this. He's not saying that he's like, the best example I can try to find is that it's like he's humanoid. He's sitting on a throne. Okay. But he doesn't want to say like he actually saw that. And he's like starting from the bottom and he's working his way up. Okay. because you definitely can't look at the face of God and live. So he's going to start from the bottom, work his way up. That's why he's starting at a throne and everything that was below the throne. Okay, so that's a simile. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so first example, inclusio. Second example, imagery. Third example, similes. All right, so I think we kind of get the point with those. Okay, personification. Happens a lot. It's important to see, and it's disastrous if you forget it. Okay, personification is giving personality to an object or an idea in order to poetically further define it or to use it in a vivid way, but not to confuse that personified object, item, or idea as an actual conscious person. Okay. The best example I can think of is Forrest Gump. He has a boat. He names it Jenny. He's out washing Jenny. He's taking care of Jenny, but the boat is not a female woman. Okay. So here we can see in Isaiah 55, verse 11, we can see the word of God, God's speech, God's utterance being personified. So Yahweh says, "So will my word be, which goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire, without succeeding in the manner for which I sent it." Okay, so how do we know it's personified? Because God is actually sending his word. He's sending it out on a mission. It's something different from himself, even though we just tend to say like our words are basically our own expressions. We don't ever talk about sending our words. Now God is sending his word on a mission, and it's going to accomplish that mission. It's going to succeed in the mission for which God has commissioned it. Okay? So we can see there. Okay. But you don't think that that word that God is sending is a second person alongside God. This is just personification. He's personifying his speech and he sends it out on a mission. Okay. Psalm 85, verse 10, loving kindness. Remember what that is? That's the faithfulness of God. Okay. And truth have met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. These are personified attributes of God. So loving kindness is personified, truth is personified, and they're meeting. They're meeting together. They're closely associated. God's righteousness and his peace, they're now personified, and they're now kissing each other. Okay? These are not conscious persons up there with God. These are personified attributes, clearly. I'd say clearly, but I don't know. Maybe people don't see it. Psalm 96, verse 6, here are four things that are in the presence of God in his sanctuary: splendor and majesty, strength and beauty. Splendor and majesty are before him. This is God's splendor, God's majesty. They are in God's presence. And strength and beauty, they are in his sanctuary. This is God's strength, God's beauty. But they're personified attributes that are clearly not conscious persons. Okay, but they're all in God's presence. Isaiah 51, verse 9, God's arm, okay, is personified as kind of the powerful way in which God does mighty and wonderful acts. Okay, this is part of the anthropomorphism that we read about. Anthropomorphism is the poetic device of describing God with humanoid parts in order to kind of better describe what he's actually doing. Okay, so here the prophet says, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Yahweh. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahav in pieces, who pierced the dragon?" Okay, so there you can learn in the parallelism that Rahav is an ancient dragon. Okay, now what you can't see in the English is that second person pronoun, was it not you? That word for you is second person feminine. And the feminine noun is the arm. The arm of Yahweh is feminine. So this is not, was it not you, Yahweh? It's you, the personified arm that cut up this primordial dragon. Okay. But here the arm of Yahweh is being personified, okay, as like the strength of God. Of course, we've already seen in Psalm 96, verse 6, that strength is personified clearly as being in his presence, okay? But the arm is not a separate person. I've recently heard an argument where some people think that the arm of Yahweh is the pre-existent Jesus. That's stretching. That's stretching a lot. But again, the arm is feminine. Okay. The sun is masculine. So I just don't think that works. Okay. All right. And of course, the personification of wisdom. We already talked about this in chapter 1. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. Okay. So wisdom is dwelling with God's prudence. Well, who's God's prudence? And then wisdom speaks in the first person and says, I find, I locate, I have found knowledge and discretion. So there you have 4 personifications in one verse, but you're not supposed to walk away thinking that wisdom is an actual female person, because who is prudence? Who is knowledge? Who is discretion? Okay. And we already saw earlier that wisdom and understanding and knowledge are basically just parallel ways of talking about the wise way in which God interacts with his creation. Okay. So personifications, they appear a lot. And notice the places where it's showing up, prophetic literature, which is 2/3 poetry, Psalms, prophetic literature, Proverbs, poetic sections of the Bible. No surprise there. So it happens. It's there. And it would be a fundamental mistake to confuse a personification with a conscious person, and all these passages would fall apart if you did so. But readers who didn't understand biblical poetry have made that mistake for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, hyperbole, which is basically poetic exaggeration. Okay, what is poetic exaggeration? You're at a restaurant and the food hasn't been there for 20 minutes. You're like, oh my gosh, I've been waiting for my food all day long. Or you're getting gas, and gas is expensive. And you're like, yeah, I just spent $100 at the gas station. We're using hyperbole in order to exaggerate, but no one's going to take that seriously. Okay, so here's some hyperbolic passages. So in Amos, again, 2/3 poetry, it's prophet. All right, the city which goes forth 1,000 strong will have 100 left, and one which goes forth 100 strong will have 10 left to the house of Israel. Okay, so you go from 1,000 to 100, and you go from 100 to 10. Okay, all right. I don't think this was meant to be put into a calculator and to say, well, if I disobey God, then 90% of what I use is going to be taken away from me. Okay. I don't think that's the intention. I think it's using hyperbole in order to make a point that you might think that you have a lot, but if you're being disobedient, then God is going to judge and punish you and going to take away most of what you have. I think that's the function of hyperbole. Okay. This particular song, sung by David, I believe. This is after Saul and Jonathan had died, by the way. They died at the end of 1 Samuel. So the song sounds like this. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Well, I'm pretty sure that these human beings were not faster than eagles, literally. And I'm pretty sure they weren't stronger than lions, literally. Okay. That's hyperbole. That's hyperbole. Okay. And it's just, it's the sort of thing that you sing when you want to sing something nice about someone in a song, Okay. This one I thought was really, really interesting and fascinating. Okay. So this is talking about the quiver, which is the little thing in the back of what an archer would hold. A quiver holds all of the arrows of an archer. And this is talking about a nation that's going to come against Israel. Okay, talking about Babylon. Okay, so this foreign nation. Their quiver is like an open grave. All of them, this is in reference to what's in the quiver, all of the arrows. The arrows are mighty men. The arrows, will devour your harvest and your food. They will devour your sons and your daughters. They will devour your flocks and your herds. They will devour your vines and your fig trees. They will demolish with the sword your fortified cities in which you trust. Okay, so now we have the hyperbolic use of arrows described as mighty men that are going to devour, which literally in Hebrew means to eat. Okay, These arrows are going to eat your harvest and your food. They're going to eat your sons and daughters. They're going to eat your flocks and your herds, and they're going to eat your vines and your fig trees. That's what um, the base part of the verb for devour is the verb to eat. Okay. Again, hyperbole. Don't read these literally. Okay. Like it's almost like if it's too good to be true, it's probably hyperbolic. Okay. But even in Second Samuel, again, that's a book that you think is mostly narrative, but of course, in there is a hymn, a song. And in the song, we can expect there to be poetry, and in poetry, we can expect hyperbole. Okay. Job 37, verse 1. At this also my heart trembles. It leaps from its place. Well, I'm pretty sure the heart didn't grow legs and jump up and leap out of its place. Okay. You would be dead if that actually took place. Okay. That's hyperbole. Okay. It indicates that the heart was extremely troubled and anxious and worrisome. You get the point. Okay. But the poetry in Job just makes it much better when you say it that way. Okay, all right. So we've looked at lots of different examples of poetry, and again, there's many, many more. I think I only used like half of the ones that were used in the textbook, but I think I wanted to give enough to kind of show that there were a lot of different types of poetry. I wanted to kind of show the sort of passages in which it would show up. I wanted to indicate that it's not just in the Old Testament, it's also the New Testament, and also to point out that it's poetry that you have probably seen before, and you're probably listening to this and nodding your head, hopefully, and saying, "Yeah, I've seen this, and I can make sense of this." And you probably can think of several other passages that fit into the mold of some of the slides that we've looked at. Okay, so how do you apply this to your life? How do you take these principles, these hermeneutical rules, and you set them up as guardrails for your own interpretation? You know, these rules that you're going to have in your own mind that are going to keep you from veering off into the deep end of unhealthy interpretation. Number one, we need to identify the kind of figure of speech that's present. Okay. Do we have a simile? Do we have a metaphor? Do we have personification? Do we have hyperbole? So we need to figure out which one it is, and realize it's possible for there to be more than one poetic device employed in a passage. So we can see, the sort of those extremes could also be used there with parallelism. We can see that parallelism can also be mixed together with hyperbole, with metaphor, with simile. We could see lots of different ones that are there. You could have two or three appearing. So whenever we come across one, let's see if we can figure out what it is. Stop what you're doing, figure out what it is. Number two, interpret the figure of speech by distilling its figurative meaning from its literal meaning. Okay, we need to distill the figurative meaning from the literal meaning. The figurative meaning is what the poet desires to highlight. Okay, so we just read a passage about the quiver of the enemy. Okay, and the arrows, of course, that are in that quiver. Okay, the literal meaning would be the thing on the back of an archer that holds arrows. Okay, that would be the literal meaning. But the poet doesn't want you to read it literally. He wants you to understand figuratively the weapons of this foreign nation are going to hurt you, and they're going to harm you. And they're going to harm you pretty comprehensively, and they're going to not just attack you, they're going to devour you, a much stronger word that's there. Okay, so recognize the figurative meaning is what the poet wants you to highlight once we've appreciated that a figure of speech is actually being used by the biblical author. Okay, number three, determine the function of that figure in context. So ask the question, why would the poet use this particular figure of speech in this instance? Okay, why would John the Revelator, who is conveying images and signs and symbols, want to convey that the lion of Jesus is really a docile, weak, and slaughtered sacrificial Passover lamb? Why would he want to do that? And once you ask that why question, you can start to see, oh, okay, I can see the purpose and the function of this particular poetic device. Okay, so we're having to stop. We're having to ask some questions here that they're going to get us thinking. But I think in doing so, we can better appreciate what the poet is trying to do. We can start to see their intentions in the passage, and we can avoid just reading it literally and just kind of forgetting what actually has been placed there in the text for the readers, what was intended. Number 4, since poetry appears in 1/3 of the text, we need to anticipate it in the text, especially in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Psalms, especially in the prophets, and especially in the hymns, whether it's hymns or songs or psalms. I guess those are technically 3 different things. Don't just read through and say, well, I might stumble upon something that's poetic, maybe in today's reading. Just anticipate it. In fact, if you're reading those particular books, you should anticipate that you're going to come across it within the first 30 seconds. I mean, just be on the lookout for it. Okay. That, it's much more than just saying, kind of in a more simplistic way, well, I'm just going to read things literally. And then if I maybe come across something that I can't read literally, then I'll take it figuratively. Um, have a much more proactive, anticipatory stance towards it, especially in those books to where it's extremely frequent. And then my final piece of advice would be to slow down your reading in order to think intently and deliberately on the meaning rather than reading quickly in order to complete a passage. I know a lot of people that are on Bible reading plans and they got to read 3 to 4 to 5 chapters a day in order to read the entire Bible through in a year. That's pretty good. It's good to read the Bible in a year. That's very, very noble. But what good is it if you read the Bible in a year, but you don't know what you read? That doesn't mean anything. If you can't remember it the next day, then what's the point of reading it? You're just saying that I read it. But the point of reading is to come to understand it, to come to grow and to learn and to have it shape your thinking. So again, the best piece of advice that I can tell people is to slow down, read much more carefully, read intently, read deliberately. And if you could read it out loud, reading out loud actually forces your mind to think about the text much more closely because you are actually reading it, but you're thinking, how am I going to pronounce these words? So you're putting more effort into the words. And it's actually better to do Bible study that way by reading it out loud than to read it quietly. So hopefully those would give you some ways to better appreciate the poetry that we actually have there in the text so that we don't just read over it and ignore what's there. And by reading it, we can hopefully appreciate what the author is trying to say, and then we can interpret the text as they were intended. Okay. All right. I'm going to cut off the video for now. Thanks for watching. If you've stuck around this long, we will next month be talking about specific literary genres. We're going to be looking at narrative portions of the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. If you're following along, that will be in chapter 9 of the textbook. Thanks for watching. Take care and have a good day.